There was a frantic pursuit. The men raced forward in frantic pursuit. The assassins were looking for Pure Wool to finish them off. The target itself was lurking behind a thick wall of foliage in the shrubbery. Pure Wool, a young man in dark, unremarkable clothes, and with long taured hair gathered in a high ponytail at the back of his head, was watching the chase tensely with his red, elongated pupils. If he can't handle them, it's all over. And before, everything in his life had been different. The young man was an ordinary vagabond who wandered the world, wandering both land and sea. He saw the past as sunny, brightly lit, and filled with former carelessness. Then, however, Pure Wool met him. A man loomed over him, a tall figure in a doily, with a cloth hanging from it that covered the man's face. And after that encounter, when Pure Wool finally woke up, there was only an all-encompassing darkness around him, and in the shadows lurked those who were trying to kill him for their own survival. With each day he spent in the darkness, he changed more and more, gritting his teeth and struggling through the obstacles he faced. And just as the creators of this hell wanted, Pure Wool became a killer. The hiding place is spreading leaves all around. The assassins flanked on all sides, glittering with eyes and all the bloodlust of their target. But Pure Wool stands up in a fighting stance and grips the hilt of his blades tighter. He will surely survive and come after them. The market was crowded with people of all stripes. Some simply walked along the crowded street, while others stopped at the market stalls. Pure Wool, a young man of 14 in shabby poor clothes, was estimating a decent amount of food in a shabby wooden bowl that he had managed to scrounge up. For him, an orphan and now just a wanderer, wandering without a purpose, this was good luck. All that remained was to find lodging, so he wouldn't have to huddle under the stars, for he had no home or any savings. Taken aback by his domestic thoughts, Pure Wool nearly collides with a man whose imposing figure cast a shadow that completely covered the boy. The latter looks at the darkening face beneath the bamboo hat. Somewhat hesitantly, even frightened, the young man tries to learn the stranger's identity, but the man smirks crookedly in response and says the odd phrase that he will still be useful to him. And then there is darkness. Pure Wool opens his eyes wide, but there is still darkness all around him. For a few moments he even thinks he has been blinded, but eventually he concludes that it is just pitch black without a single ray of light. The young man legitimately wonders about his whereabouts and tries to get up, but is horrified to realize that his body does not obey. He grinds his teeth with the strain of trying to move, and the strain brings impotent tears to his eyes, but all in vain. How could it have turned out this way? Was it the work of that strange man at the fair? But Pure Wool was sure he hadn't crossed anyone, so why did he have to suffer now? He loses track of time, so long he has to lie and look into the abyss above him. Everything is mixed up, reality and dream. Has the young man been awake all this time, or has he occasionally lapsed into unconsciousness? Nothing is clear, and his gut is writhing in despair and all-consuming loneliness in this emptiness. In order not to go crazy, I have to repeat my name, the name of my mother and father. So it comes out to remember your identity, but how much more will you have to endure? My stomach was already aching. It was frightening to think that I could die of simple hunger. Either that or go crazy. Questions are swarming about the motives of the man to whom the 14-year-old orphan did absolutely nothing, not even begging. Sure, Pure Wool is just a beggar, but is it any reason to do that to him? The injustice makes tears roll down his youthful eyes in a hail of tears, and his bitten lips bleed. But suddenly the numb fingers began to move slowly, and soon my entire right hand was able to rise. It was easier to breathe, and gradually Pure Wool regains control of his body. He feels that it is very damp all around, and that there is a cold stone floor under his back. Everything indicates that this place is somewhere underground. All of a sudden, you hear the distinct sound of drops crashing on the water surface. The realization shakes him instantly, and Pure Wool, overpowering himself, crawls toward the sound. His body trembles, but he keeps moving, breathing heavily. His heart is filled with a desperate rage, and he achieves his goal. A thin trickle of water runs down the stone wall. Pure Wool puts his hands on it, greedily gulping down the liquid. He manages to quench his terrible thirst, and now the young man is able to think about something else. For example, to test the strength of the wall. But reality is cruel, and all the prisoner achieves is to wound his finger until it bleeds and collapses tiredly back to the floor, covering his eyes. However, his attention is attracted by the approaching figure of a man. Above him stands a faint blue glow, himself. With an expression of genuine incomprehension, the doppelganger wonders about the young man's desperate desire to stay alive. Pure Wool is at a loss for words, and the stranger with his own face circles around like a kite over his prey and scoffs, and then abruptly squats down at the helpless young man's head, looks into his exhausted face with wide-open eyes, and advises him to give up. The doppelganger was sure that this was how Pure Wool could find peace, by dying here, in a place in the middle of nowhere, but the young man himself thought very differently. He cannot find peace until he stabs the bastard who condemned him to suffer and die a painful death in the heart. Until the vengeance is done, there will be no peace in this world or the next. Shifting his eyebrows, he shouts to the astonished double that he will not give up. Never. Darkness again. Pure Wool pushes his eyelids apart. The encounter with himself turns out to be only a dream or a manifestation of insanity. The young man is not yet sure what it was really about. There is still silence and damp darkness all around, but water continues to ooze from the wall nearby, and there are islands of dense moss growing on the gray stones. It's not clear whether it's edible, but the unlucky boy doesn't have much choice, so he picks up a small lump and shovels it into his mouth, grimacing. But immediately he is twisted in a gagging feeling of disgust. The plant tastes impossibly disgusting, but the main thing is that nothing bad happens to the body in response to the ingestion of the moss, and therefore it is possible to eat. It is necessary, and Pure Wool chokes on the disgusting moss, but he doesn't stop. He needs strength to survive, and therefore food, no matter how disgusting, as long as it's not poisonous. A meal, however dubious, provides some energy, and the young man takes advantage of it to walk along the wall. Soon he manages to get around all sides of this room, which appears to be only 9 by 9 meters square. Expectedly, a closed trap. Suddenly, there is a strange sound. Pure Wool mechanically turns around to look at it. In front of him was an iron door with a small window at the bottom, a bright light pouring in. It was intolerable to the young man's tired eyes. Covering his face with his hands, Pure Wool walks resolutely toward the blinding light, despite the pain, for there was someone there. It was only a short distance to the door, a couple of miserable steps, when a vague shadow appeared in the passage. And then the light disappeared abruptly. The flap slammed shut with a distinctive sound. Pure Wool froze, once again left in the darkness. His eyes were involuntarily watery from the sudden change in light, but his nose caught the scent, the smell of food. On the bowl in front of the iron door were rotten fish, tea leaves, pork, probably leftover meat torn from the bone, the scraps from at least 5 meals. It was highly unlikely that one person ate it all. There were clearly more of them. That meant there were at least 5 people on the other side of the cell. But why would they keep just one prisoner? It's not worth the trouble. Consequently, there were other prisoners just like Pure Wool. But what did the 5 guards want with all of them? The bowl reeked of the spices of Sichuan cuisine. He decided that he had more than enough time to think, but in the meantime, he needed to eat. Besides, the leftovers tasted better than moss and were much more satisfying. The discarded bowl rolled on the floor, and Pure Wool looked resolutely in front of him. It had been at least 4 months since Pure Wool was thrown into the dark cell. Once a day, a window on the door would open, and through it another hand would serve another bowl of food. And then the shutter would slam shut, time after time after time. At first, the young man, desperate as he was, even tried to bang on the door furiously, but the guards did nothing more. They kept him in the tiny room without access to fresh, unhumid air. In time, Pure Wool was able to adapt to the pitch-black darkness. He'd occupied his time with physical exercise, for no other leisure activity was better present in the cell. Gradually, he also learned to distinguish movements in the darkness, and it turned out that there were a lot of insects around, mainly scolopendras, briskly moving their numerous legs. But it turned out that in the shadows lurked more dangerous creatures. One day, with its red eyes flashing, the silver snake wrapped its sharp, venomous fangs around the poor man's arm and dug deep into his skin. Pure Wool howled in pain as the limb rapidly swelled and turned blue from the toxin injected under the skin. Soon the whole body began to burn furiously. The young man wriggled in agony on the cold floor, unable to remember himself from the unbearable pain. Then he managed to survive, and when the flap opened again, as scheduled and a hand dropped a bowl of food under the door, the prisoner came to his senses. He pounced fiercely on the scraps, thinking only that he would never die. After a while, the snake crawled back to the man. He looked at it with a tired look, not the slightest bit frightened. Something had changed in him after the bite of the crawling creature. He could see much better now. It was a wonder that it was all because of the snake, but it was not without reason that the young man had once heard that the body can become stronger by coping with the poison. and if the prisoner succeeded in gaining immunity, gaining a weapon. The snake sinks its fangs into my palm again. The poisoned hand swells up again, covered in swollen dark purple vessels. The body, like the last time, is seized by fever. From the pain, Pure Wool already doubts his conclusions. Perhaps he should have been more careful, but even so, the first time was much worse. Snake. Her eyesight is impaired because of her constant exposure to darkness, but even so, she remains an excellent hunter. She creeps up to her prey unnoticed and can immobilize her by sound. She knows no greed. When she is full, she tries not to attract attention to herself and not to scare away insects. The only sentient beings in this darkness seem to be the snake and Pure Wool, who has gradually changed. Now his hair is dark as night, and his irises with vertical pupils are red as blood. But one day the ground shakes and small stones from the crumbling slabs begin to fall from the ceiling. With utter amazement, the prisoner realizes that the door is open, and so he walks down the narrow corridor until he reaches the nearest cell like his own, about 20 paces away. There is a miasma of putrid stench in the air. The prisoner looks in the passageway and sees the corpse lying in the middle of the room, a long dead man. Presumably a young man of the same age as Pioval himself, but it is impossible to say for sure. Is it the same in the rest of the room? After some time of examination of the passageway and the wall, a door to another corridor, away from the cells, is visible, and someone has removed the deadbolt from it. Pioval pushes the flap with determination and freezes in the opening. In the darkness, the silhouettes of two people are outlined. A young boy in navy blue plain clothes and a girl in pale pink, sitting next to her on a collapsed piece of wall, appear before Pioval. They look rather neat and not as poor and worn out as Pioval's. There is a pause between them, and to the surprise of those two, the young man simply walks past them to another cell. He looks into it and sees the same picture he had seen in all the rooms before, a rotting corpse in full swing. Finally, the girl calls out to the unexpected guest. She pounces with questions about his identity and where he came from. The stranger is sure that she and her companion are the only survivors. At the same time, though the girl formally looks in his direction, she doesn't seem to see him at all. It seems that only Pure Wool has vision in the dark. An acquaintance takes place. The girl's name is So Yi Wool, and the guy's name is Song Jong Woo. And they are surprised to find out that there are other sections of the prison besides the one where they were held. Pure Wool humbles them with an attentive look. Then he calls after him, heading for the other sections. Yo Wool is once again genuinely amazed at their existence, and gustily rising to his feet, gives Song Jong-woo his hand because it's dark in the corridor. He nods, hesitating a little, and then walks after her. In the other section, there are even more survivors, as many as 5. While Yo Wool and Jong-woo are actively getting to know them, Pure Wool walks around the tiny cells again, noting that there are far fewer people who have starved to death than in his own section, or rather, almost no one has died of it here. For the most part, those in here took their own lives. There was much more food. Did the wardens treat them differently? But what did they want to achieve by such discrimination? Suddenly, Yo Wool is pulled out of his thoughts by Yo Wool calling out. From the stories, it seems that the survivors of this section were locked up at the same time as themselves. Already in a group, they were walking along the corridor, the stalactite ceiling of the cave cantilevering above them. They moved until they reached an even more massive iron door. Pure Wool tried to open it without a second thought, and it gave in even too easily. The group was blinded by an intolerable light. Their eyes immediately began to water, unable to bear the agony. For a couple of moments, it seems like a way out, but that's not the case. They were in darkness for so long that even the torches burning on the walls blinded them. A large manor house appears before them. The group approaches the gate and goes inside. There is no one there. The structure itself is barely hanging on by the flimsy structures, and the surroundings are empty, with no household items. It is clear at once that it is a decoration, made in a hurry. But why? Pure Wool is called by name by one of the survivors, a girl with snow-white hair and soft blue eyes. She introduces herself as Lai Min. The girl rather unexpectedly violates the young man's personal space, peering curiously into his eyes and saying that they are red and beautiful. The boy is nervous and clarifies how red they are. Anxiously, he thinks to himself that it must be from that snake bite. He didn't want to stand out in a place like this at all. But Lai Min reassures her new acquaintance, saying that they only turn reddish in the torchlight, and that it's hardly noticeable. The girl smiles as she sees Pure Wool's relief, and notes with it that he is not at all like the others. For while the others are confused, The boy is able to reason soberly. Yo-wol and the silent Song Jong-woo burst into their almost one-sided dialogue. The girl invites them to team up with them, but Pyo-wol doesn't give an unequivocal answer, arguing that she wants to observe the situation. Yo-wol thinks for a while, but doesn't try to beg him, simply agreeing, specifying that he can come if he's up to it. Lai Min, on the other hand, agrees to their offer. Pyo-wol watches their dialogue from the sidelines. He thinks they've probably been here a lot longer than he has, and it's possible that they're not all right in the head. I didn't want to believe it, but the others? For now, however, it doesn't matter. We can watch from the sidelines for now. The survivors have only known each other for a short time, but they are already divided into groups. The group led by Yi-wol and Song Jong-woo, the group that follows Kang-il, the group that gathers around Yim-il-jun, and the group led by Go-young-sun, and the loner who has never joined anyone, Pyo-wol. It was only logical that there were whispers around the distinguished survivor. They idly scratched their tongues, gossiping about how he had managed to become the sole survivor of his section. There was also talk that Pyo-wol might have killed everyone else himself, and now he didn't want to join anyone else. He tried not to pay attention to the evil tongues, because he knew that people, wherever they were, did not change. Besides, he had more important things to do than a bunch of gossip mongers. He looked around at the houses and the dungeon walls. The buildings themselves were obviously built quite recently, but the dungeon, judging by the huge amount of moss grown in the stone cracks, was a long time old. Someone simply decided to use it, and that someone, whoever he was incredibly rich, because a simple worker could not do such a thing. Suddenly, a thin rim of a semicircle of light glimmered high on the ceiling. The survivors gathered beneath it and realized that a wicker basket was descending toward them. When it hit the ground at the bottom, the light naturally disappeared and the young people could see the contents. It was real food. The most impatient were about to pounce on it, but Yi-wol protested by covering the vegetables with her hand. She voiced an idea that could be shared equally among all the groups. The survivors stared expectantly at their leaders, who later took it upon themselves to divide the provisions equally. However, that's when Pyo-wol came to his senses. He demanded his share and was about to take it when Yim-il-jun, the guy with the fierce eyes and the red blast hair on his head, intercepted his hand. He said that the food was in their hands and could not be taken without their permission. Pyo-wol frowned and smashed his palm into the guy's face, pressing his thumb into his right eye. Blood spurted out. Yim-il-jun screamed in pain and fell on his back while Pyo-wol continued to hold his head and sit on top of him. He slammed the back of his head against the floor several times, menacingly demanding that he repeat the words he had said earlier. The survivors were worried, grumbling, but no one came to help while their main group yelled in pain. Only Yo-wol did something about it. She promised that no one would touch Pyo-wol's share. The other ringleaders nodded in agreement. This reassured the red-eyed young man. He stepped aside, taking his finger out of his bloody eye socket. The survivors, huddled together in a flock, finished their portions while Pyo-wol, sitting on the most distant and elevated spot, watched the courtyard. All that is going on around them is a test, a selection of those who are needed by the unknown organizers of this nightmare. This has been the case since the beginning, when they were locked in the cells, and it will continue until the kidnappers reach their goal. Many will die in this struggle, and those who survive will become enemies to P-Will. Yo-wol came up to him and started a conversation. She was interested in the young man's condition. After that incident with Il-jun, many people left his group, and Yo-wol's group became the largest. She also stood out from the other leaders. She took more food for her charges and ate less than everyone else, so the children trusted her. Yo-wol was again invited to her group and was curious about the young man's life in that dark room in the first sector. But Pyo-wol was comfortable there. Plus, he wanted to increase his immunity to poison. The pain from the bites, however, the boy no longer felt, and he refused her offer again. Soon a basket of food came down to the survivors, and the latter were dumbfounded. They had not been given enough food this time. Pyo-wol, on the other hand, understood everything perfectly with an apathetic look. Here we go. Makno-sam, a young man with naive eyes and shoulder-length brown hair, was one of the survivors of the last sector who joined Yo-wol's group. He was weak, but he made up for it with tenacity. And this Makno-sam was recently found dead. The men of Yi-wol's group lamented and wept over the mutilated body. But everyone, including themselves, understood why it was so. The boy was killed because he was the weakest. Song Jong-woo, with desperate anger in his eyes, spoke in favor of finding the murderer. But Yi-wol had a different opinion. She didn't care who killed who, as long as someone from their group died, and they should be repaid in full. The weakest of the other group would be next. This marked a war. They killed the weakest of the group, Go Young sang, and that was just the beginning. Every morning there was a dead body. First Seo Yi-wol's group, then Yim Il-jung's, Go Young sang's, Kang Il's. The string of deaths continued. No one trusted anyone. The children turned into hungry, bloodthirsty demons. This was not the first time Pai Wol had eaten moss, but he still couldn't get used to its disgusting taste. The others had not yet gotten that far, but the young man had not long to live in peace and quiet. The stranger's footsteps were listened to by at least 4 people. It was very unlikely that they had just wandered off. It was Il-jung's group, who was now walking around with a rag over his injured eye. They were looking for Pyo Vol. The leader himself had already killed 2, and now he was going to kill the bastard. But suddenly a subordinate walking nearby screamed in pain. Something had bitten him, and soon the guy was lying dead on the floor, foam coming out of his mouth. The rest of us looked around feverishly, trying to spot the invisible enemy. But one of them was unlucky. Pyo Wol sneaked up behind him and grabbed his head with his hands so that it was easy to wring his neck in that position. But he hesitated. He stared at the group leader with unblinking eyes while he froze in horror. Il-jung demanded that his comrade in arms be released. Pyo Wol pondered whether to let his hostage live or not. But in the end, his neck snapped and the breathless body fell to the floor. Sooner or later it would have happened anyway. Death would have befallen the unfortunate man. Il-jung rushed to avenge his men with fierce and desperate determination. He struck blow after blow, but Pyo Wol dodged each one. And at one point the leader realized that his opponent had disappeared, but then abruptly appeared behind his back and pushed him hard against the wall, threatening that this time he would not confine himself to a glance. Il-jung leaned his back against the wall and watched hastily as Pyo Wol approached him. Like a prey mesmerized by a snake, with excitement, he blurted out the first nonsense that came to mind. He suggested teaming up. His adversary, confused, arched a questioning eyebrow. But the leader went on talking nonsense about how he was even willing to give up his seat, that he would listen. But Pyo Wol didn't believe any of that, because that guy would only listen at first, and then he would get brave again and do something worse. So he struck Il-jung and snapped his neck, despite his pleas for mercy. Pyo Wol killed him because he is still weak. Yim Il-jung's group broke up because he and his subordinates were found dead. The leaders were stunned by the news. Pyo Wol killed Yim Il-jung, and it made the other leaders wonder how strong this loner was, since he could put down 4 men on his own. Pyo Wol certainly knew how to make people fear themselves. That's what Go Young sang, the leader of one of the 3 groups already, was thinking. There was so little food coming down to them that it was no longer possible to divide it among all. Many died because of this, and all the survivors became murderers. And now that Pyo Wol had killed Il-jung, who was in charge of this circus of freaks, no one would touch the guy. He's shown what he can do. Go Young sang was aware of the danger of this man and strictly forbade any approach to him, much less any revenge, for there is no one scarier than someone who has nothing left to lose. The children nodded their heads in confusion. In the courtyard, a guy from their group ran into the courtyard, out of breath. Barely out of breath, he reported that 2 of those who had been kicked out of Yi-wol's group had been spotted with potatoes in the red house to the north. Go Young sang's subordinates jumped enthusiastically from their seats, ready to rush in and kill for some measly potatoes at the same moment. Grudgingly, the leader agreed, and they set off for the red house. There on the steps in front of the door sat 2 girls, one a short-cropped brunette and the other a blonde with long hair. And one of them actually had a potato in her hand. The group, noticing such a valuable vegetable in the midst of starvation, became like a starving pack of demons. Only Go Young sang suspected that something was amiss here. They were at too great a disadvantage, but he did not have time to react. His men ran toward the girls like chain dogs, disobeying the leader's orders to stop. One of the fugitives suddenly blew a loud whistle. At the same moment, people with wooden implements jumped out of the windows. It was clear that it was a trap. Soon the leaders of the attackers, Yi-wol and Jongwoo, came out as well. The girl hinted transparently that there would soon be fewer hungry mouths. Go Young sang, trying to keep his boys alive, offered to kill himself alone instead of them. But what good would that do for Yi-wol? She set the trap because there's too little food. We need to cut down on the competition. The massacre began. Pyo Wol watched it all from afar, sitting on the roof. He analyzed what he saw. Children began to use their surroundings to cut off paths, to set ambushes. The buildings, on the other hand, are arranged in such a way that it would be impossible to penetrate with good security. Most likely, this place really exists, and here they built an exact replica, so that the prisoners would get used to it, and get used to killing. Someday, those who manage to survive this hungry meat grinder will be sent to the original. Judging by the central building, the mansion belongs either to a very influential person or to a large clan, which it would be impossible to attack rashly, so as not to get into big trouble. That's why they need a bunch of tools they can use and throw away. They made all the conditions to turn their prisoners into professional killers. The group of Yi Wol and Jongwoo were relaxing after the massacre they had committed. They were laughing and discussing what had happened in a relaxed way, lying in a circle and eating vegetables. Only Lai Min sat on the sidelines. She was horrified by what her comrades had done, and she herself included. The girl could not be still, for she could still smell the blood, and the revulsion sent a large shiver through her body and brought tears to her eyes. What had they turned into? The beam of light on the ceiling, always heralding the descent of food, appeared earlier than usual. Evol's group was surprised, but didn't smell a catch, just getting ready to protect the supplies. He was standing not far from them, and there was a tense expression on Puvol's face, as if something had frightened him. The reason for the commotion soon became clear to everyone present. From the gap, instead of a basket of provisions, 4 men with their faces hidden behind hoods and masks descended. When they landed, they immediately started beating the gathered prisoners with sticks, making them lie on the ground in twisted poses. Puwol was careful not to move so as not to attract unnecessary attention. While those lying there continued to be brought up with wooden sticks, 3 tall men came out to them, in decent but not flashy, monochrome robes of lilac hues. Their faces were covered by masks with vertical stripes. The one in the middle had 1, 2 to his right, and 3 to his left. They were the ones in charge of the whole thing. One of them put his hand out in front of him, gesturing for the beating to stop. The masked and hooded men obediently stopped and straightened up. The masked man, with one line, introduced himself as the first sword and declared that the prisoners' lives now belonged to him. One of them was about to object, but his head was quickly cut off. Everyone else froze in horror as blood gushed from the decapitated body. If you put poisonous creatures in a jar, they will devour each other until one survives, and that one will have the strongest poison. This is called poison goo. As intended, only the most violent and with the strongest instinct for self-preservation survived the children. The swords decided which of them was worth a closer look. The second sword was suggested by So Yi Wol, since she had gathered the largest group around her and had earned undeniable authority among the children. It was worth keeping an eye on her, so that the girl wouldn't cause unnecessary trouble or go against them. Song Jongwoo and Kangil were also interesting, though overshadowed by Yo Wol. However, they had the best fighting instincts. We should also take a closer look at the survivor from the first sector, Pyo Wolum. The fact that he survived in this sector is a strange circumstance. The conditions there are the worst, and there is the least amount of food. Consequently, there should be no survivors in the first sector, so we must keep an eye on P-Wol. As the second sword left, the first wondered again. Why had their captain agreed to this contract in the first place? It stated that it had to be given personally to the captain of the Red Phantoms. It was a 7-year assassination order, with the condition that nothing should be allowed to get out to the Red Phantoms. The reward for its fulfillment was 500,000 gold yanes. Not a day passed without brutality. The children were trained without pity or indulgence to turn them into professional killers. Those who were ahead could receive some reward in the form of rest, while those who crawled behind knew hell. Those who could not stand it were doomed to die before they ever saw the light of day. Bai Wol was striving to survive, no matter the cost. His results were average, unlike Seo Yu Wol, who was predictably in the lead because she had a sharp mind, flair, and the ability to assess the situation. The first sword expected more from Pyo Wol, the only survivor of the first sector, but ordered him to keep watching for now. Pyo Wol, on the other hand, was studying the book given to them by the swordsman about the bifurcated thunder technique, which even green youths could master, although they were no longer forced to read. The children were given 3 months to master the technique, and when they learned it, their bodies would be reborn and would be able to sense ki and store energy. These instructions were given to them by the third sword. Both the other children and the wardens themselves consider this technique only the first step in understanding Chai, but none of them seem to fully understand it. Bifurcated thunder. Naturally, it is physically impossible to bifurcate thunder. It probably has something to do with the speed of thought. If Pyo-wol, thinking about this technique in this way, can master it, he will discover something completely new about himself. So the young man trained hard, and the currents of Kai enveloped him. However, he did not want to show that he was mastering the martial arts faster than the others. One should not stand out for either the worse or the better. And so far he had managed to do so, but during one of the night training sessions, under the watchful eye of the warders, including the third sword, my partner Pyo-wol made a lunge that aimed to slit his neck. It was a death blow, not a training blow at all. Pyo-wol was able to deflect, but that didn't cancel out his surprise. The boy who had nearly finished him off declared, with a feverish glint in his eyes, that there was no pleasure in staged combat. The instructor paid zero attention to them, and so the partner threw himself into battle, furiously attacking Pyo-wol. He circled around him and used throwing blades, concealed weapons. Pyo-wol easily fought off the singles, but suddenly his opponent threw out a huge number at once. The blades literally surrounded him on all sides. However, Pyo-wol was able to parry all of them with a broad sweep of his knife. In the same instant, he was attacked from behind, but he still managed to turn around in time to block the blow. The head-turning guy who put up the deadly fight flew past, but not a few seconds later, he showered a dozen incredibly fast blows on Pyo-wol, and all were reflected. The third sword, noticing this, exhaled quietly. His opponent smirked maniacally and remarked that Pyo-wol was good at blocking all his punches, but he was only defending himself, and that was no fun. With a mocking plea to amuse him, the guy went on the attack again. Pyo-wol thought, disappointedly, that there seemed to be no choice. He unclenched his hand with the knife, and it flew down, sticking its tip in the tilled ground. The third sword watched the action questioningly. He thought he'd given up, but when he got close to Pyo-wol again, he kicked him in the sternum. The overconfident sparring partner's mouth gushed blood. At the same time, the first and second swords were discussing the situation. The children were growing much faster than they had anticipated, and the second sword optimistically remarked that they could probably manage in 5 years rather than 7. But the first advised them not to underestimate the target. No one in Sichuan was more talented than their target, and even perfect training might not be enough. With the slightest mistake made, the Red Phantoms would be finished. That's why their captain decided to train children completely unrelated to them and send them on a mission. If they fail, the Red Phantoms will have no problems. The second sword, wrapping his palm around his fist in a respectful gesture, apologized and excused himself for not underestimating the target in any way. The first commanded to keep his guard up. Suddenly they were faced with the sight of Pyo-wol throwing his opponent aside, ruthlessly breaking his right arm over his knee and towering, staring with a stern look in his scarlet eyes. The boy sat on his knees, screaming in pain and cherishing his broken arm. Pyo-wol towered over him, looking sternly. Suddenly the first sword, who came up with the second sword, asked, "Did Pyo-wol do this to the boy?" There was no way to deny it, so I had to agree. A moment later, the mentor put his sword to Pyo-wol's neck with an outstretched hand. It was so lightning quick that the young man couldn't even see it coming. He had no idea that a man could move so fast. Pyo-wol immediately became nervous. The thought dawned on him that he had stumbled and should not have hit at full force. One mistake, and the young man was dead. The man, however, put down his sword. The first one turned his back on him and slowly walked away, at the same time explaining to Pyo-wol that an assassin never, under any circumstances, leaves no trace, and if he broke someone's arm, he was foolish because he revealed his identity and level of martial arts mastery. It is inadmissible to forget this rule of leaving no trace. The other children froze, stunned and frightened. Pyo-wol, on the other hand, waited for the first sword to leave before finally exhaling. 6 years later, the buildings were practically in ruins. There were piles of junk piled up all over the yard, broken beams, rocks, and bags. One of the instructors, wearing a mask and a red hood, was walking between this mess. He stopped next to the next rubble, and then he struck sharply into the mountain of debris, pushing the guy hiding there out of the way. The warden ascertained that whether it was the enemy or not, the hapless killer was already dead. The Red Hood turned and walked on. It didn't matter how well their trainees trained, because if they didn't learn the turtle technique, that is how to slow their breathing to conceal their presence, they would be spotted. The man found 2 others and admonished them. They are still not ready. There was only one left. The instructor looked around, listened to his gut, but he couldn't see any sign of anyone else's presence. He'd been told there were 5 men hiding in this place, but he couldn't spot the last one. Maybe they were mistaken. Maybe he wasn't here at all. In the end, the Red Hood gave up. He tapped a wooden stick on the floor and ordered his way out, admitting defeat. From beneath some rags behind him, just a few paces, stood a young man with long black hair and high ponytail and scarlet eyes. Pure Wool. He bowed when they let him go and walked away. The warder looked after him angrily. What a bastard. There were 3 people sitting by the fire, Yoo-wol, Jung-woo, and another with disheveled hair. He was the one who got up from his seat when Pyo-wol came in, and he grinned and said, "What an important bird they've got here." Pyo-wol recognized him as Seo Jak-sang, who had once again changed his appearance, this time to the face of Gwang-min. He was coolly told that he had recently died anyway. What good would that do? He didn't remember Deok-sang's real face anymore. Yoo-wol, on the other hand, voiced her concerns about the food. It was getting better and better. It could mean that soon they would be sent on a mission. In the small, bright office, slightly empty for lack of furniture, the first sword, Lim Se-yeol, sat at his desk. The mask was on the table and no longer hid the man's face, which was wrinkled and scored obliquely between the eyes. He looked tired, and his hair was completely grayed out. Janggu is a cruel place. It's either you or you. The children had already managed to surpass Lim Se-yeol when he was their age. Out of 300 of them, 30 survived. The second and third swordsmen entered the room. The first allowed them to remove their masks, in which it is simply impossible to breathe normally. 6 years is a long time after all. They looked at each other and nodded. The faces of the second swordsman, Gu Shinhang, exhausted with hair down to his jaw, and the third swordsman, Sang Il-shin, relatively young and open, were revealed. It was about the contract when everyone was seated around the round table. Almost 7 years had passed, and it was only a matter of time before they would soon be released from these dark dungeons. In addition, the trainees were exceeding all expectations, and many were already stronger than the instructors. It was becoming difficult to control them. Of course, it was a pity to get rid of them, but those were the terms of the contract. It's time for the final test. All 30 men lined up in lines. Books were placed in front of them, and it was announced that 3 of them would have to master the martial art provided, and the other 27 would have to kill them. The disciples stood there with tense expressions on their faces. They were uncomfortable. Many of them did not want to kill again, and they could not believe that these bastards were not enough. The first sword, however, immediately added, "This is the last test for them, and they won't have to kill again until they're released to the surface." This unexpected news gave the children some hope. Only 3 had to sacrifice themselves so that the rest could get out of here alive. Pyo-wol, however, did not get carried away. The bait they had laid was not bad. Those 3 would turn into walking targets, and the martial art provided would surely be mastered by the target. Of course, on a completely different level. Pyo-wol stretched out his clenched fist, volunteering to be a target. Whether he became a scapegoat or a wolf would be seen afterwards. Yoo-wol advised him to proceed cautiously, for now everyone would hunt him down. He briefly replied that he couldn't wait. In the chest of the distraught boy went the blade of Chung-woo. Another target was dead, and it was a pity for the killer, because this one was chosen by lot. But even if it was unfair, there was no choice. The only one alive now is Pyo-wol, who hasn't been seen for days. Yoo-wol last saw the boy a couple of days ago during a training session when they were fighting. Jak-san, with one eye slyly squinted and a grin pulled from his ears, suggested that we simply outbid the instructors and run away. Jung-woo agreed that it was a good idea, but the swordsman must have done something about it and put restrictions on the trainees. Yoo-wol urged them to return to the subject later, but for now they needed to find Pyo-wol, so they went on their way. Out of the shadows, Pyo-wol, who had heard their conversation, finally revealed himself. He looked with some pity at the cold corpse of the target, and he lowered the lids of his glassy eyes with his palm. The instructors would hardly leave anyone unattended who might be plotting such a thing, which means now is the most opportune moment to uncover their true motive. There were 2 hooded men standing at the post of the temporary instructor base. Pyo-wol looked at them carefully from behind the rocks. The base was well guarded, but that was no problem for the boy. They had been taught that the turtle technique could only be used while stationary, but with the split thunder technique, you could split your breath. This fundamentally changed everything and allowed them to move without revealing their presence. One's cognitive abilities simply weren't enough to detect Pyo-wol, so he calmly walked past the guards. The guy was finally in the center of the base. He entered a room with a round table and 3 chairs. Pyo-wol began to rummage through books, looking for hiding places in an attempt to find something that might lift the veil of mystery. Who needed to raise assassins? What kind of place had they copied? And soon Pyo-wol gets to the gilded capsule with the paper inside. It turned out to be the same contract for 500,000 gold yang for the Red Phantoms, a contract to kill Gongxing. How strong is this man if it took them 7 years to train him? Pio Wol gritted his teeth. Out of 300 people, only 30 survived. Was it worth it? Suddenly the guy heard someone coming. The first sword was wary, stopping in front of the entrance, and swung the door open sharply. There was no one in the room. However, Lim Si-el still realized that someone was here. Too sloppily, Pio Wol put everything in its place. There was no time for that. Toward the first sword, walking with a very heavy dark aura, came the second and the third. He told them that someone had come to his room, and that this uninvited guest must be in the cave. He must be found. Shin Hang and Il Shin were stunned. It can only be someone who is very good at hiding his presence, which means there is only one option. Pio Wol, who, hiding on the ceiling above the swords. The second sword was amazed. All the children are after this boy, and he managed to sneak in. They couldn't just leave it alone, but they couldn't punish him without proof either, because the other children might revolt. So they decided to redirect their discontent toward Pio Wol, using the Call of the Abyss. It's an extreme measure, but you have to show them all who is really the master of their lives. Lim Si-el stood on a high ledge without a mask and holding a flute in his hands. With the words, "Know the true hell," he held it to his mouth. The children continued to search for Pio Wol. Even those who boasted that they could easily track down the little rat did not find him. But suddenly, there was a strange sound. Everyone fell to the floor, covering their ears with their hands. They were in a lot of pain. It was as if something was eating them from the inside. It became clear to Pio Wol, watching all of this. They activated the restriction. Everyone was lying on the floor, writhing violently in unbearable pain. One Pio Wol stood there, his ears just ringing from any exposure. They activated the restraint, but Pio Wol only slightly hurt. He supported Lai Min, lying on his stomach behind his back. Why was he the only one not affected by this punishment? This must be dealt with soon. Pio Wol tried to pour his inner energy into Lai Min, the white-haired girl who was now lying on her stomach in tears, even though it was dangerous. But the girl had mastered the split thunder technique, and there should be no problems. But her energy turned out to be just fine. Then what was the difference between the two? Same food, same conditions, same training. What else? Poison. It dawned on Pio Wol. If the restriction had something to do with the poison, that would explain it. Thanks to the snake bites, the guy had developed a resistance to it long ago. But how did they activate the venom in all at once? You can't release it with just a sound. What if it's not just poison the children, but some toxic insect? What if they have been spiking their food and water with poison goo, and now awakened by sound? The instructors were approaching them. Pio Wol, thinking hard, decided that running away would give away his stability. So he immediately collapsed to the ground, resembling his fellow soldiers. It was dangerous for instructors to give away that he was different from the others. One of them approached Pio Wol and reported his whereabouts. The first sword came toward them, absolutely furious, and in the process drew his blade. He thrust it under Pio's collarbone with a swing. Now the boy was writhing in pain for real. Si-el was going to kill the intruder because he had revealed his true abilities, and it was very unlikely that such fangs could be blunted. Better to get rid of them now. But the man was stopped by the second sword. They need Pio Wol for the mission. Without the boy's ability to go anywhere undetected, they can't fulfill the contract. As long as they have goo poison, the boy is easy to control. Pio Wol kept squirming as if a toxin was affecting him. The first sword cooled his ardor and ordered the children to be injected with the antidote. The instructors obeyed the order, and the students, who had been suffering for a minute, were finally able to sit up and breathe normally. The first sword announced. They were punished because of Pio Wol, who sneaked into the instructor's base. If any of them do something similar, the execution will be repeated. Pio Wol meditated. He knew that the snake venom had somehow weakened the restriction, and now it had no effect on the resistant organism. The kids kept looking for that last target. Now, in the first sector, where the guy goes to practice and in fact usually spends all this time. All of a sudden, Pio Wol himself appeared behind their backs, scaring the hell out of Gongxing. He asked the purpose of his visit. "You've all assured me that just to talk." About restraint, it hadn't escaped the girls' notice that when everyone was rolling around on the floor in pain, Pio Wol wasn't among them. But after the torture, he was already lying down with everyone else. It means that he came after the activation, and the poison either does not affect his body at all or weakly. Lai Min suddenly had a hunch that someone was pouring inner energy into her during the restriction. It made her feel a little better. Could it be Pure Wool? The guide easily admitted that he knew about the restriction, but would not tell anything to the comrades who tried to kill this modest person. Deksang, Yi Wool, and Lai Min promised in their friendship and help, each of course his own. Sang offered to stop by their troop when they all got out. Yi Wool that the people following her wouldn't touch Pure Wool, and Lai Min, blushing shyly, said she would consider him special and would never betray him. After some silence, Pure Wool did talk about the goo poison. They put toxic insects in them, which are mostly asleep, but are activated by the flute, and their venom affects their internal organs. The guy himself is immune. Yi Wool nodded her thanks and told me to call for help if I needed it. She and Sang headed away from the sector. The only one left alone with P. Wool was Lai Min, who, terribly embarrassed, blurted out her real name, Lai Sol Min. She wanted the boy to remember her. P. Wool looked at Li Sol Min's back, who had told him his real name, in confusion. The flap on the ceiling of the dungeon was open and sunlight streamed freely, cutting through the eternal darkness. The first sword announced that today they would leave this cave. The children stared at the man in amazement. They were relieved at the news. The first sword instructed Yi Wool to bring the children to the surface when the instructors and mentors left the dungeon. The girl gladly agreed. It was interesting to see which of the children would survive after all. They are strong, but their target is a martial arts master. No one in the Jiangyu is his equal. They're going to have a hard time. But that doesn't concern the swords now. They have served their purpose. As soon as the elevator with the adults rose to the surface, the children began to cheer with insane joy. They would finally be released. So Yi Wool organized the crowd into groups so that everyone would go up, albeit gradually. Then she approached Pure Wool, who was looking up and couldn't believe his luck either. The girl spoke to him. She told him that Goo's poison was over, as Lai Min knew a lot about poisons. The only thing left to do was to get to the surface. The group with Pure Wool, Yo Wool, Li Min, and Jiaxing was the last to go up. In the process, it became clear just how deep underground they all really were. Apparently, it's not just hellish conditions, it's just pure hell. And that's where the children had to spend the whole 7 years. The climb was almost over when Pure Wool suddenly tore the sleeve off his clothes and began to blindfold himself, advising the others to do the same if they did not want to go blind. After all, spending so many years in a place where there was not enough light and darkness all around left its consequences on people. But the sun stung their eyes even through the cloth. A man approached the basket and looked at the clutched children, trying to hide from the intolerable light. Their pale skin was suffering as well, reddening from the burns. The man's utterly unemotional voice rather noticed that at least someone wasn't useless. Above them towered the captain of the Red Phantoms, Gu Zumiang, a man with blonde hair slicked back in dark circles under his eyes. He ordered them to be loaded onto a wagon and taken to the Pure Wind Manor, where they should be helped to adapt to the outside world. Pure Wool remembered the voice of the captain of the Red Phantoms. They were driven through the gorge in horse-drawn wagons, and they arrived at night. Gu Zuang wished them to get used to their new home and not to relax, for if they slowed down, he would personally kill them. Pure Will was moved in with Go Shinnok and Jock San, who found him standing by the window of their room. The new roommate, who in the past had favored a life of dark seclusion, offered to give them a bath because there was a well in the courtyard. After washing and changing his clothes, P. Wool lay on the grass and gazed serenely into the night sky. The children were slowly settling in and getting used to the surface again. They were having fun, watching the flowers they couldn't wait to see again, while the wind gently ruffled their hair and clothes. But one of the Red Phantoms in black attire and a mask with hair whiter than snow came and laid out before them the weapons they would soon need. At the Pure Wind Manor in the Full Moon Palace, Gu Zumiang and Lim Sai Yel sat at the same table across from each other in a study. The captain of the Red Phantoms thanked the first swordsman for the work they had done, but he brushed it aside, saying that they were doing what they had to do. The man, however, went on to praise him for the sacrifice they and the children had made that would make their group thrive. Gu Zuang also reported that Lim Sai Yel would be able to retire to a well-deserved retirement, as both he and the second and third swordsman had approved his resignation. It was the least the captain could do for people who were dedicated to their cause. The conversation turned to a discussion of the mysterious customer, whose identity could never be established, because this is a line that should not be crossed. Besides, why piss off a big shot who could pay them 500,000 gold yen? Until the Red Phantoms are equal to the White Lotus, the largest faction in the Jianghu, special care must be taken. But if they manage to fulfill the order, the balance of power will change. They will be able to confront the White Lotus. Pyo Wol looked at the curved dagger with the serrated point that the Red Phantoms had given him. Jek-san teased him, saying, "Are you shaking your ankles?" He suddenly agreed with such a statement, but his comrade didn't believe him. But Jiaxing was clearly nervous because he was talking more than usual. The boy denied it, justifying his excitement by saying that after their suffering the best reward would be someone's severed head. Before they went out, they were told they had to be stealthy. The fourth sword raced through the forest. The children were never far from him, leaping nimbly among the trees with glowing eyes. Their elders had taught them well. A pity, of course, that such goodness would go to waste. They're better than many members of the Red Phantoms. The fourth sword stopped abruptly on the precipice and ordered the children to freeze and hide. Immediately they disappeared from sight, activating the turtle's breath. The man ordered them to climb the mountain visible from the ledge. The manor house would be visible from this peak. It looks exactly like the one in which the children lived underground. Their target is the man in the Palace of the Bright Moon. The Palace of the Bright Moon was a small building at the far end of the manor that the children remembered so well that they were sick of the place. They were furious that the man in it, the one for whom they had been locked up for 7 years and brutally trained to kill, was quietly living there. Wuku sang. A long-haired girl dressed in a rich greenish robe stood by the bushes with luxuriant white peonies. She looked intently with her beautiful blue eyes at the flowers. When she touched one with her finger, it crumbled to ashes. It was young Solran. An elderly woman in a dark fur cloak over one shoulder, leaning on a wooden staff, approached her. The head of the Ma sect is a venerable, brilliant master. The woman asked her apprentice if she was still angry with her, but the one replied that not at all, but that the girl was concerned about her plight and wished to be freed from it. The master immediately became enraged, reminding her who had picked her up, washed and fed her, and then taught her martial arts, and therefore it was simply not permissible to ask to be set free. Solran, on the other hand, quietly remarked that of course she would follow her master, and that she in turn should not be upset. It's not good for the master's health. The teacher calmed down a bit. If they don't get an answer today, they will set in motion the plan they have been preparing for the past 7 years. Suddenly Junhua ran up to them, bowing low to the master. She brought the news. King Qing had finally given an answer. They agreed to their offer. Now it was up to young Solran. Their fate lay entirely in the hands of the girl, though the master was sorry, for she wanted to make her her rightful heir and ended up turning her into a political tool. But how to deal with this problem? More precisely with the contract with the Red Phantoms, that very backup plan. They had thought. Pydewall didn't know how much time had passed. They had gone on their missions at night, and now they could get some rest, but a storm was brewing. Suddenly, the young man had a bad premonition. He opened his eyes and immediately felt the spear slam into his comrade's body, piercing him to death. Pydewall froze in horror and surprise. A skin-headed, muscular man with a bare torso, Yo Jingnuk, put a man in dark clothes on a spear and lifted it above him. It turns out they weren't lying, there really are killers hiding here. He tossed the dead body away from him. How dare they sneak up to Qingqing Mountain? Don't they value their lives? He ordered the adepts in yellow robes with the yin and yang symbols on their backs to find and destroy the impudents who dared to attack them. Pyo Wol realized that they were at a great disadvantage and suggested that the others retreat. The adepts poked at the dust with their spears until, suddenly, men in dark robes emerged sharply from the ground and scattered in different directions. I was in the middle of a fight, and I was in the middle of a fight, and I was in the middle of a fight. The Qingqing members, on the other hand, became angry as they watched the 5 swift silhouettes and were about to rush into pursuit, gripping their weapons comfortably. Yo Jingnuk, on the other hand, swung and threw his spear. It easily pierced the body of one of the assassins. The man took another spear and sent it flying again. The second intruder was slung on a shaft, and another, and another. There was one last one left. The weapon almost caught Pyo Wol, but he kicked it away, spinning in the air. He landed on the ground, touching the dust with his hand. The assassin brought the spear back to them with much more speed. So much so that the adepts didn't realize what had flown by. A moment and Pyo Wol snapped 4 necks. The spear, on the other hand, scratched Yi Jingnuk's oracle. He grinned broadly and repeated the order to find everyone and kill them. Pydewall would not be able to handle them all at once. We had to get out. Jingnuk, on the other hand, approached the body of one of the killers. He had lost a lot of blood and was as pale as death itself, but he was still alive. He said in a weak voice that he did not want to die and asked why he deserved such a thing. The man was surprised, but explained, pulling out his spear. The murderer went against the Kingshin clan. That's what he deserved. Peel Wool ran through the woods, hiding from pursuit. Someone had turned them in, but no one knew the name of the target except the boy. Then, who could it have been? By the way, there was no sign of the fourth sword or his subordinates anymore. Looks like they escaped before they were attacked, which means they went to cover their tracks. I was in the midst of a hailstorm of arrows, which I could barely dodge in time. And yet 2 arrows entered his chest closer to his shoulder, giving his dark robes a burgundy hue of bloodstains. But why would the Red Phantoms want this? Do they really have a split there? Or has the customer changed his mind? So far, Peel Wool is sure of one thing. The Red Phantoms have betrayed them. In that case, they'll have to survive on their own. Peel Wool, after killing the archer in the yellow robe, jumped into the water from the cliff, hiding from his pursuers who noticed him. As the lad made his way ashore, he noticed a scrawled message on the rocks. About 200 yangs to the north. Then, deep in the forest, another. 400 yangs to the northeast. The boulder on which it had been scratched was bloody. Apparently, whoever had left the messages had been wounded, and quite seriously. Perhaps mortally. Once again, I could hear the voices of the men searching for him. I don't think they'd set up a net just for some assassins, since, judging by the clothes, there was more than one clan, at least 7. It didn't seem to be about the phantoms. A premonition pierced Peel Wool. He immediately fell to the ground, dodging the sharp swing of the knife. The attacker was Lai Min, who did not immediately recognize her comrade in arms, but when she saw the boy's face, she dropped the knife, smiling in relief. Lai Min mumbled with exsanguinated lips that she was glad to see Peel Wool and collapsed on her side. Her wound was serious, and she could have died at this rate. The girl knew nothing about He Wool and Zhang Wu, for the group had split up. They stayed and fought to buy time for the retreating men. Peel Wool gently lowered Lai Min's head from his lap to the ground. She looked pale. She didn't have much time, but she took it somehow calmly, even though she didn't want to die. But Pell could not save her, so she resigned herself to it. The girl was well aware of her condition, but at the same time was glad that she would not have to die alone. Peel Wool promised to be with her until the end. In the end, what they had to go through to survive would end up like this. But who did this to them, and why? Someone they hadn't even seen in their eyes, controlled their lives, and then just left them to be mauled. Lai Min hoped that they would be repaid 100-fold for it, for the injustice, for the fear of the unfortunate children. Peel confessed to her exactly who their target was, who had kidnapped them and tortured them for 7 years, and now, when they had become useless, they were being wasted. The boy promised that as long as he lived, he would not stop looking for those who had ruined their lives, and he would definitely get his revenge, even if it was the last thing he could do. Lai Min smiled, stroked his cheek, and asked him to call himself by his real name. Peel Wool could not refuse his dying friend. She, on the other hand, thanked him for doing his last will and died. Her hand fell to the ground with a lash. At the Red Phantom Manor, the fourth sword brought Gujuan a recording with a brief order, abolition, and reported that the assassins had been ringed in. None of them should survive. The captain was sorrowful. It was a pity to throw away the weapons they had prepared for so long without ever using them. The fourth sword was worried. The customer might want to cover his tracks and destroy the Red Phantoms themselves. But the captain hoped for the secrecy at their hideout. All they had to do was wait for things to settle down. Gu Juan could find out the identity of the customer at any time, but he believed that there was a line that was not allowed to be crossed, especially since they had even warned about the cancellation, so you should mind your own business. He waved a piece of paper in front of his subordinate. Suddenly the fourth sword figured it out. They marked the messages with a special scent. But it was too late. Men with guns had already burst into the palace and were killing members of the Red Phantoms. The first sword, already unmasked, fought, and in between ordered everyone to flee, for they would not be able to cope. The captain was asked to leave, but Gu Zuang did not. He, enveloped in a red glow, drew his sword, and he rushed forward. Heads flew to the floor. The captain ordered to fight. But suddenly a huge stream of golden energy was directed toward him. The man tried to resist with his scarlet, but the attacker's strength was immense. The captain of the Red Phantoms was coughing up blood, leaning on his sword. It was Zhenghua's Heart of Perdition. Gu Zuang immediately realized exactly who the customer was, the Amag clan. He was already regretting that he had decided not to reveal their identity so as not to cross the line. The wrong choice had led the Red Phantoms to their downfall. Then the man will take Zhenghua with him to the next world. A fierce duel ensued. The red energy clashed with the golden energy. Gu Zhuang, for a dirty assassin, had excellent martial arts skills, and for Manhwa, it was really fortunate that they fought during the day, because at night the advantage was on the man's side. Neither he nor the Red Phantoms can be left alive. The Amai clan needs to destroy them all. Manhwa applied a destructive technique. This is the end of everything. Not just Gu Zhuang, but all the Red Phantoms. Carrying suffering and death under the cover of night, the man helped the group rise from the bottom. He dreamed that one day they could equal the White Lotus, feared by even the strongest in the Jianghu. So that was it. The stream was tearing people down and destroying the palace building. The captain of the Red Phantoms had to survive, and he prepared to fight to the last man, but he was attacked by another opponent and confused. That was enough for Manhwa to get quite close and deliver the final blow. The man was dented into the ground. The head of Amai entered the hall, accompanied by two other girls, a red-haired girl in a yellow robe and a brunette in a red dress. Gu Zhuang accused the brilliant master of betrayal. After all, they had ordered it themselves, but the woman did not let him finish. She pierced his skull with her staff, soothing him forever. The blade of Solran's blade plunged into Lim Sael's chest. He dropped his sword and fell to his knees. Ever since Imai's leader became a brilliant master, they have been rapidly gaining strength. He asked the name of his beautiful assassin. It turned out to be an apprentice of the head of the clan. She was rumored to be as beautiful as she was talented. Now we know what we're talking about. The first sword raised its face to the ceiling and fell on his back. Decades of training, and he was still no match for the apprentice of the Amai clan. The girl stepped away from his corpse, looking back at the body and pursing her thin lips. The fourth sword was dragged to the head of the clan without his mask. It was he who led the assassins to Qingqing Mountain, but he refused to name the exact number and also accused them of treason. An eerie expression appeared on the woman's face, and a dark purple haze enveloped her. She placed her palm on the murderer's forehead, and he was pierced with intense pain, under the influence of which the man gave out the exact number after all, 28, and begged for death. The Amai clan got rid of 24. Just in case, we have to find and kill them all. The palace of the Red Phantoms was destroyed and set on fire for good measure. As if nothing had happened, the master walked past her apprentice, struck by her cruelty, and ordered her to prepare both heart and body for the upcoming wedding. The girl obediently agreed. In the meantime, Kill Wool had reached Qingqing Manor. He glared fiercely at the men on patrol. Since he had been raised as an enemy of the Jianghu, he would become one. On the horizon, dawn was blooming with pink hues as a young man in gray robes, with his black hair tied in a bundle and a basket on his shoulders, was about to leave Qingqing. He was going to get herbs to stock up on for emergencies. After passing the adepts guarding the entrance and exchanging a few words with them, he went deep into the forest. When he was well back from the grounds of the manor, someone suddenly jumped on his back from above and put a jagged dagger to his throat. The assailant swung it, leaving a bloody wound on his thigh. The attacker's eyes burned with an inhuman scarlet fire. He let go of Du Jin, that was the name of the Qingqing clan disciple, and he sat down on the ground, crying in pain. But the man in dark robes did not think to sympathize and help him. Instead, he gave him an interrogation. This attacker, of course, was Pio Wool. He asked his trembling victim who this Wu Gu Sang was. Wu Gu Sang turned out to be the greatest talent, born under the banner of the Qingqing clan. He has mastered most of the martial arts, and it is said even the former masters of their clan are interested in him, so they teach him. It became clear why it took 7 long years to train the assassins. Pio Wool, having learned all he wanted, applied the reincarnation technique, stealing Du Jin's face. There were some differences from the original, but not that much. The apprentice, guessing his motives, was horrified, and so Pio Wool was able to get inside the Qingqing clan under the guise of an apprentice. He walked quietly through the crowd of people, mingling with it. Then he gradually concealed his presence. He managed to reach Wu Gu Sang's manor. At this time, there were 7 people sitting around a long table in Shang King's palace in the clan. The head of the Qingqing clan spoke. Holy Ghost. A venerable old man with a long gray beard. He asked about the situation outside. The head's right-hand man, Wu Jinpen, reported that the surveillance of the assassins had reached a dead end. The situation is outrageous. Who dared to do such a thing in Qingqing territory anyway? It angered everyone present, especially when the clan was in such a dangerous state. Demon war against heaven, when the danger of being overrun by hordes of demons was closer than ever. Incredible martial arts master Lai Guak created the Alliance of the Will of Heaven. Those who agreed to unite and fight, for example, the Shaolin Temple, the Wudan clan, and the Huashan Mountain clan, performed great feats and regained their former glory, while those who refused to fight, among them, were the Qingxing clan and the Amang clan. They received empty titles of 4 heavenly kings, which they could not back up with anything. If Qingxing wanted to catch up with the other clans, he had to concentrate, but the right hand assured the head that they would achieve this in 10 years. It was about Gong Sang. He locked himself away from the world around him to find redemption in his training.